To celebrate the debut of the FV4005, which actually drove around at Tankfest this year, and hopefully you were there to actually see it. If not, there are a couple of clips on the channel that you can actually have a look, as well as searching on the official Tankfest website, as well as some of their official channels as well. So I'd highly recommend going and seeing this thing in action. There should be something on screen and playing right now of the actual FV driving around. Of course, this is not only available in real life to have a look at, it's also available in World of Tanks console. So with that being said, World of Tanks did actually sponsor, or at least were a partner to the whole Tankfest this year, and yeah, we're going to check out what the FV4005 is actually like in the game, as I'm sure some of you have already seen it and probably played it, but also whether or not it really does look somewhat similar, and also what sort of thing this tank can actually do in the game with one of the better replays that I've actually had in the vehicle. So without further ado, let's jump in. So the FV4005 is of course one of the highest alpha damage vehicles within the World War II mode on World of Tanks console, and there's a reason for that. The 183mm main armament that this tank actually gets, making it very, very dangerous to go up against. However, there are a ton of weak points, and by weak points I mean the entire tank is a weak point, and that means that everything that hits you going through every single time, and you are never really going to bounce a shell unless it goes underneath the vehicle through the tracks, which even then, because the hull armor of this vehicle is very, very low, it often doesn't happen. So unless you hit the gun or the underneath of the tank somehow, yeah, you're not going to actually bounce, which makes it quite difficult to actually play and do a ton of damage, even if every shell does a ton of damage. So we're going to see what we can do, but essentially we've loaded it out with the advanced reload equipment, which allows us to swap between our rounds. So now each of the rounds deals a different amount of damage, which means that our Hesh round, for example, will deal 1450 damage, our AP round will deal 1150 damage, and our HE will deal 1650 damage. So depending on which round you're choosing, the amount of damage changes. But obviously there is a negative to having the higher alpha damage, which is that the penetration goes down dramatically. And so from your standard AP rounds, which can bounce unlike the Hesh or HE, which deal damage regardless of if they actually pen or not, they'll deal some damage because of the splash, but essentially the AP has 310 pen, which is very, very good, and almost every tank in the game can be penned by 310mm, as long as you're aiming at a relatively weak part of the armor, and even some of the stronger armor pieces of some of the vehicles can be penned with 310 pen, especially if you're looking down on them, and because the tank is so tall, it's quite easy to look down on a lot of vehicles. So very, very good AP rounds, they work, but they're not the exciting ones. The Hesh rounds are where it's at, 1450 damage, which has 240 pen, which once again, as long as you're aiming at the weak points of most of the vehicles you'll meet, you will be able to pen them, provided you don't get unlucky with RNG. Obviously you have to have a tighter grouping, but the accuracy remains the same on all of these rounds, so you just kind of have to hope that the RNG goes in your favor. And so talking about that, the ammo speed, this is one of the key features of the FV4005. It's quite slow, 830 meters a second as it currently stands within the game, which means that in order to hit your targets you have to give a little bit more lead than what you would see with a lot of the traditional mediums that have the APCR, or some of the faster rounds that can go up to 1400 meters a second. This one much slower, so difficult to actually hit targets on the move at super long ranges, but as long as you aim and you correctly predict where they're going to be by leading your shells, it's not too much of a problem, and I don't feel like it really negates the tank, because at the end of the day it makes it even more fun when you do actually hit and pen. And Then you've got the HE, 92 pen, basically nothing, but can deal 1650. So primarily only usable against light tanks or super lightly armored mediums. And even then, it can get absorbed by a lot of the tracks of some of the light tanks as well as the mediums. So provided you hit them in the side, you will pen them. You can pen a lot of the mediums, whether they're light tanks or lightly armored mediums, if you hit them in the side as well. So this is an additional option that you can do if you know that the side armor of a vehicle is lower than 92 pen, which you do get deviation on how much pen you actually deal or can output, versus you can also get unlucky and it can come down. So there is a RNG element to how much pen each one of your rounds gets, but the average value 92, not too bad. And yeah, it's certainly usable against gorillas, waffles, that sort of thing. Very, very usable for that system, and it works really well. So that's why I take 3 of them. We got 10 rounds of Hesh because that's primarily the round that you're using against a lot of opponents, and then AP for those heavy and heavily armored vehicles where Hesh just isn't going to pen and you need to guarantee yourself a pen within the game. So that's how we've run this tank, and of course then we've got ourselves premium repair kit, we've got a premium med kit, and of course enhanced combat rations. And then we are running the commander with the following perks, primarily wanting to get the accuracy down, because as you can expect with such a large caliber gun within World of Tanks console, you have pretty bad accuracy as a base value. But when you do actually change how the tank kind of performs in that regard with all of the perks and equipment, you can get it down to 0.29, which is what I've got in this vehicle. Now that is with improved ventilation, which will make a big difference to that. Very, by maybe 0.02 or something like that, but either way, it really does help out to have that. DPM wise, 3600, it's nothing spectacular, not the best in the game, not the worst in the game, but of course you do have a long reload, 19 seconds in order to reload when you have fired. So it's a one pump wonder within the game, which, can end up with you getting taken out pretty quickly if people realize that you've fired, because remember, you have no armor, so you've got to either hide or make use of buildings and cover to be able to avoid those shells coming back at you, which is how the FV really works in its kind of entirety. You've got to make sure that every time you fire, you are getting into cover. 10 degrees of gun depression make the tank a little bit more useful, but as I said, it's very, very tall, so can be a limiting factor in those close quarters engagements where maybe light tanks that are quite small come in and sometimes you can't get the actual depression to go down into them, but that's quite a small feature of this tank. So with all that talking and experimenting with what we've actually done with the tank, let's take a look at the replay that we managed to have on one of my more favoured maps, Sand River. So jumping in, we might as well give a little bit of a backstory to the FV4005. It was kind of introduced as a way to counter some of the Soviet vehicles that were coming in at the end of World War II, including the IS-3 and stuff like this, which were showcased. And of course, with the FV4005 and coming up against things like the T10 potentially, if there were ever to be kind of some form of engagement between the UK and the Soviet Union, then there would be required to actually be able to deal with those T10 vehicles, the IS-3s and all of this. And so what better way than to smack on a gigantic main armament that can relieve those vehicles straight out of their existence. So yeah, the FV4005 was primarily designed to do that, but obviously never actually had to, thankfully, in order to, be used in war. But you can see here, straight off the bat, in World of Tanks, you could see very, very hard hitting. We've hit one vehicle, taken them out, pretty low amount of hit points. It was a light vehicle, so the Teeth Breaker, which is one of the Warhammer 40,000 collaboration vehicles. Don't know why he went in at the beginning of the game, but he did. And either way, we managed to at least dump in one round into him. And then we hit up the TVP, or the Skoda T50 even, with those Hesh rounds, dealing 1500 damage in one shell. So you can kind of see where the sort of damage potential really comes in. And within, what, a minute and a half into the game, we're up to 2.3 thousand damage, nearly 2.4 thousand. And I guess when you're playing in the 4005, you at least want to deal enough damage so that you cover your own name, 4005. So when you're kind of holding back and you're using kind of a more sniping gameplay in the beginning, this is kind of what I would recommend when you're playing in a tank like this. You just simply cannot get spotted, because if you do, people target you. Things like artillery that are in the game will just rinse you of all your hit points. So realistically, not wanting to get spotted at all at the beginning. But as the game develops, where you find out where the opponents are, you can move in and change the direction of where you're actually at. So you can see here an AP round into the lower plate of the 60TP. Potentially could have hit the upper plate and still penned, but we aimed for the lower plate. Couldn't quite see because there's bushes in the way. You can't see through them. They're not transparent, or at least they're transparent, but not completely away from where you can see. So, of course, now we're just waiting for the 60TP to make a mistake here and us be able to capitalize on it. But we've done 3,500, and here comes the 60TP. We rush our shell here. Can we get him? And of course, I did not see the rock until it was far too late and we'd already pressed the fire button. So 60TP gets away with that one, but maybe he won't get along or get away with much after the Ruthless goes in to chunk away some of his hit points. Now, one thing to mention within the game is there's a lot more high alpha TDs, especially when you consider things like the Ruthless, the Turan, the Jaegeru. All of these vehicles, when you combine them into one, mean that the FV is no longer kind of the reigning supreme ultimate power that comes to TDs and one-shotting people. Although, you know, those tanks do considerably less damage, they are far more consistent in how they can actually approach the game and deal their damage compared to the FV. Obviously, they get significant improvements to both mobility or armor as how they kind of balanced in that way. Whereas the FV is purely that slower, more methodical playstyle where you really have to keep your targets either at range so that they don't spot you, or being in those close quarters engagements where as soon as you fired or taken a hit, you can pull back around a corner, preferably behind a building that can't be destroyed, and then you can hide there until some unsuspecting victim either fires and you realize that they fired, or until you realize, oh well, I could take 400 damage and deal 1500 back to them. It's kind of how the FE really works in the game. So unfortunately here we're not reloaded to dump one into the Progetto. We probably could have taken him out in one if we actually fired at him, but unfortunately, still on that long reload. Now, we know that there's quite a few TDs at the back, and I was hoping to get one into someone there with a little blind fire. Obviously, in World of Tanks, whether they're spotted or they're not spotted, they're still there. So if you pre-fire or hit them before they've actually been spotted, you can still do that, which is where utilizing kind of blind firing within the game can be a big benefit to actually improve your own games and potentially get a couple of hits in as you go through. Now, we have made it past the 4005 damage mark, so let's load a Hesh round here for the Turan, and not a better feeling than hitting one of the broken tanks that are in the game, the Turan, the Soviet tier 10. That is much faster, has 950 damage, that is very consistent with good accuracy and brilliant camo. In kind of direct contrast to the FV, pretty slow as the FV, but obviously quite different in the way that it actually plays, much slower, and of course you don't have that consistency and the reload speed that the Turan has, which means that when it comes to how the game actually plays and how well a vehicle like the FV is in the long term is probably worse by quite a standard margin, because speed and the flexibility that a tank like the Turan offers is far better than the FV. But there's one key characteristic that we haven't mentioned, the one-shot capability, which unfortunately for the Turan, or fortunately for everyone else that isn't the Turan, it isn't able to one-shot a whole lot of vehicles unless it ammo racks them, which, you know, any tank in the game can ammo rack a vehicle, and luckily the Turan doesn't get any sorts of things like that, which is great. But FV definitely does, and you wouldn't be surprised when you're rolling around with a with a 183mm main armament. So now we can kind of push in. We've done 7,500 damage, and you can see how quickly the damage really racks up in your games. Most tanks having about 2,000 hit points, so quite easily taken out enough hit points to really take out 3 entire vehicles from full health, even though we've hit multiple different ones. You know, you get my point. The FV has just under 2,000 hit points, so it makes trading possible. Now here, I'm pretty confident that we're going to win the game, so I'm happy to take a few hits. I was hoping that the gorilla would get spotted. Unfortunately for us, the 114 does actually hit, and unfortunately for me, we fire at the 114, which means the gorilla now is going to be able to reload and potentially get one more into us. He's got 1,300 juicy hit points that I'm really hoping we can get. He looks like he's still going for me. He's going to stop in the open. We're going to fire. We hit him, and we traded with the German tier 10 tank destroyer. But we still picked up 8,843 damage in this game with 8 hits. So you can kind of see how much damage you deal on average, especially if you got those hash rounds. They really do boost that number up. And yeah, 3 enemies taken out, 8,800 damage done, and then basically the equivalent of 4 full health vehicles within tier 10. So not a bad game at all, and it kind of shows you the power and the fun that the FE 4005 can do in the game. I really love playing this vehicle. It is a fantastic time to actually play, and since I 3 marked it, it's one of my favorite vehicles in the game. It was even better to see it in real life rolling around and finally being restored into working order, whereby at least they can take it around the arena at Tankfest. And hopefully you guys were there, but if you haven't been there, then at least you've got to see a little snippet of some of the clips that we've seen from the real life tank, as well as World of Tanks console. So hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to hit the like button, and of course you can subscribe down below if you want to see more videos like this. I really do appreciate your support, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day. Check out these videos for more World of Tanks console, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.